Hi, Modern World History students. So we're beginning a new unit. This is Unit 9A, the Cold War in Europe and Asia. It's 9A because the Cold War cannot be covered in one unit. It's a time period that spans 1945 through 1991. And actually, in this unit, we'll go beyond 1991 to talk about what the consequences of the Cold War have been and what the aftermath of the Cold War has been. So we have to divide it into two parts, 9A and 9B. And the Cold War is a period in which the United States and the Soviet Union became rivals. We had been allies fighting Germany during the Second World War, and yet in the period immediately after the Second World War, that alliance broke apart, and the United States, along with other democratic countries, formed a sort of a camp known as the Free World. And the Soviet Union, along with other communist countries, formed a camp known as the Communist Bloc or the Soviet Bloc. And these camps were rivals of each other, and there was conflict between them. And although that conflict, for the most part, did not erupt into actual war, it certainly threatened to do so at times. And with the advent of nuclear weapons, it even threatened to result in a war that could exterminate all of humanity. Never got to that point, obviously, and thankfully. But understanding the Cold War is rather important to sort of understand the shaping of our world today, because there are conflicts in our world today that kind of originate in Cold War rivalries. So this first lesson will cover two sections, Section 1 and Section 2. And basically the goal of this lesson, as well as the next couple of lessons, is to try to understand how it is that an alliance became a rivalry. So in Section 1, I hope you'll be able to explain why the Western democracies and the Soviet Union had different ideas about what Eastern Europe should look like after the defeat of Germany, and also hope you'll be able to explain how the Yalta agreements seemed to be a compromise between these different ideas. So you're going to learn about the Yalta Conference. We'll reintroduce you to Prime Minister Winston Churchill, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, and discuss their declaration of liberated Europe and the free elections that declaration promised. So we're going to start at the top of page 5. And as we do that, you may want to page through to the big map that's in your packet, because at the beginning here, we're going to talk a little bit about this map and why I have it drawn up this way. So remember that as World War II wound down, in that last year or so of World War II, what was going on was the Allied armies were driving the Germans back from the places that they had conquered at the beginning of the war. Right at the beginning of the war, in the first year or 2 years of the war, the Germans had conquered really most of, or had made alliances with most of Europe. And in the last year of the war, the Germans had to be driven back from the places that they had conquered. And the colors on the map here represent who did that driving back. So the areas that are in blue, are areas that were liberated by the Western Allies, by Britain and the United States. And you'll see that 3 major countries are affected by that: France, Italy, and the western part of Germany. Though there are other countries as well that are colored in blue, I'm directing your attention to those 3. So you'll remember how in 1943, the Americans and British invaded southern Italy. And when they did so, Benito Mussolini was arrested, removed from power. But then Germany invaded Italy and took over Italy. And it was the Germans, in the end, whom the Americans and British had to fight in order to liberate Italy from the Germans. And they gradually did so. Similarly, France had been overrun by Germany in the spring of 1940 with the German Blitzkrieg. And then in June of 1944, the Americans, British, and Canadians invaded Normandy and began the process of driving the Germans out of France. British and American forces also drove the Germans out of Belgium and the Netherlands, and then, of course, penetrated into Germany itself on their way to the Elbe River, where they stopped their advance. But what that meant was that Western Germany was also taken over by the armies of the Western Allies, Britain, the United States, Canada, France. And you can see that other countries as well, the Scandinavian countries, for example, Denmark, Norway, and also Greece was liberated with the help of the British. On the other hand, on the Eastern Front, the Soviets, of course, had defeated the Germans after the German invasion had penetrated hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. The Soviets had defeated the Germans at Stalingrad, and from that point on, the Soviets were on the offensive, driving the German army back out of their territory. And not just out of their territory, but also out of other territories conquered by Germany at the beginning of the war, or even in some cases before the war broke out, driving the Germans out of Poland, for example, and out of Czechoslovakia, and ultimately crossing over into Eastern Germany itself, meeting the Americans at the Elbe River, and taking the German capital of Berlin, bringing an end to the war. But the Soviets also took the war to Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria. Those were three countries that became allies of Nazi Germany during the war, and so the Soviet Union invaded those countries and defeated them. And Yugoslavia largely liberated itself. But like these other countries, as you'll find out, they became a communist country in the years after the war. So to understand the future of Europe, to understand where Europe was going to go in the years after the war, you have to get a sense of what was going on in that final year of the war. Because which countries liberated you from the Germans really determined the future of your country for the next 45 years, or even more, okay? So the countries of Western Europe, the countries that were liberated by the British and the Americans, those countries would soon be free to decide their own futures and decide their own governments. Those countries would be truly liberated. The countries in red, however, the countries where the Soviet army drove out the Germans, or where the Soviet army invaded in that last year or so of the war, those countries would not be free to determine their own futures. What was happening here instead was the Soviets, having taken over these territories, now installed communist dictatorships there. They reconstituted the governments to be dictatorships that were communist dictatorships. So the blue and the red on the map, fundamentally, yes, first and foremost, it represents who liberated those areas from the Germans. The blue areas liberated by the Western Allies, the United States and Britain. The red areas liberated by the Soviet Union. But then that was going to have additional meaning for the future of these countries moving forward, because the blue areas would become part of the free world, free to elect their own governments, choose their own futures. The red areas would become part of the communist bloc, with communist dictatorships installed by the Soviet Union and preserved in power by the presence of Soviet troops. So that's projecting a little bit down the road here, as we move forward. And I think that it would be really smart for you right now to pause the video and take a few minutes to copy this information down onto your big map in your packet. You'll notice I'm not requiring you to know all of the countries. We're really focusing just on the major countries. But when you copy down the names of these countries, it would be really smart to color code them, just as I've color coded them here. You don't have to use blue and red. You don't have to sort of fill in the entire countries, perhaps simply writing the names of the countries in different colors. And you'll notice that in the case of one country, Germany, you will have to take note that it is divided, that the western part of Germany was liberated by the Americans and British and would become part of the free world, and the eastern part of Germany was taken over by the Soviet Union and would become part of the Soviet bloc. So take a few moments, pause the video, record this information on your map, however it makes sense to you to do it, and then we'll come back to it. All right, so as the war was winding down in February of 1945, the leaders of the big three Allied countries, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or if you prefer, Great Britain, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and Joseph Stalin, the dictator who ruled the Soviet Union. They met at a place called Yalta. And Yalta is down here on the Black Sea. It was a location that was insisted upon by Joseph Stalin, as a matter of fact. Stalin um, was unwilling to travel very far from the fighting fronts, since, as he argued, he was in personal command of the Soviet armies in a way that Churchill and Roosevelt were not. And so Stalin sort of insisted on this location that was sort of on his home turf at Yalta. Otherwise, there would have been no reason to meet there. It was about as far out of the way as you could get, particularly for Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was a dying man. President Roosevelt died in April of 1945. This last meeting between himself and Churchill and Stalin happened in February. So he really only had about 2 months to live at this time. And Stalin even remarked that he regretted making Roosevelt travel all that way, that if he had known Roosevelt's condition, he would have agreed to a different meeting place, which is a shocking example of empathy for a man, Joseph Stalin, who showed no empathy at almost any time in his life. But anyway, this was the last meeting. There had been other meetings between them during the war, but this was the last meeting of the big three, right? The leaders who had brought about this victory that was now imminent. Now, in February of 1945, the war in Europe was not yet over. It would not end until May. But by February, it was very, very clear that Germany was now going to lose the war. By February of 1945, the forces of Britain and the United States had penetrated into Western Germany. The Soviets were now penetrating into Eastern Germany. Germany was going to lose. And so the main focus of the discussion at Yalta was, what is Europe going to look like after the defeat of Germany? And the reality is that Churchill and Roosevelt came into the Yalta Conference with one idea of what Europe should look like after the defeat of Germany. And Joseph Stalin came into the Yalta Conference with a very different idea of what Europe should look like after the defeat of Germany. So it reminds you a little bit of the Paris Peace Conference that ended the First World War. The victors are coming together to talk about the future, but they have different ideas of what that future is going to be. In the case of Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt, for them, the only acceptable future for Europe would be for all of the nations of Europe to now be free to decide their own futures, to choose their own governments. For them, the entire purpose of the war had been to liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny. They did not wish to see the people of Europe, in this case, the people of Eastern Europe, simply forced to trade Nazi tyranny for Soviet tyranny. They didn't want to see the people of Eastern Europe be liberated from Hitler's totalitarian government, only to now have to be victims of Stalin's totalitarian government. So, in the eyes of Churchill and Roosevelt, the goal of the war was to liberate all the European nations so that they would now come out free to choose their own governments and choose their own futures. For them, the cost of the war would be at least partially wasted if that was not the outcome of it. Freedom for all the European nations. Joseph Stalin came into the Yalta Conference with a sort of very different idea about the future of Europe, at least of Eastern Europe. You have to remember that his country, whether we refer to it as Russia or the Soviet Union, had now been invaded 3 times in the period of 150 years by powerful enemies coming out of Western Europe. First, there was Napoleon Bonaparte in 1812 invading Russia. Then there was the German army in 1914 in World War I invading Russia. And finally, Hitler and his invasion of the Soviet Union here during the Second World War. So 3 times Russia or the Soviet Union in a period of 150 years had been invaded by powerful Western European states. And all 3 times Russia had basically barely survived and had sustained horrific casualties and damage and disruption because of these three invasions. For Stalin, that had to be prevented in the future. That could not be allowed to happen again. And as Stalin saw it, one of the biggest problems that Russia and the Soviet Union faced was the fact that the Eastern European nations were not strong enough, not powerful enough to resist Napoleon or to resist the German armies. And so for him, the future of Europe needed to be this. Eastern Europe needed to be strong enough to resist a future invasion and needed to be friendly to the Soviet Union. So he wanted Eastern Europe to be strong and friendly to the Soviet Union so that Eastern Europe would effectively function as a sort of a shield or barrier to protect the Soviet Union against some future invasion. So for him, ensuring that Eastern Europe would be strong and friendly to the Soviet Union meant that the Eastern European states must now have communist governments. He believed that any other form of government in Eastern Europe would not remain friendly to the Soviet Union. He believed that capitalism, that is the system of economy that we have in the United States and that we have in Western Europe, capitalism is always about getting more stuff. It's inherently competitive, and capitalism drives countries to try to get control of resources. And so if the countries of Eastern Europe became capitalist countries bordering on the Soviet Union, he was convinced that they would eventually try to, again, invade the Soviet Union to take Soviet resources. So they needed to be communist countries, and he wanted them to be dictatorships who were subordinate to the leadership of the Soviet Union. So that's why when the Soviet army pushed into these countries, either liberating them from the Germans, as in Poland and Czechoslovakia, or punishing them for their role in the war, as in East Germany, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, as the Soviet armies pushed in there, he did not reconstitute the old governments that existed prior to the war. Instead, they created new governments there that were communist dictatorships that would be subordinate to the Soviet Union. In other words, they would do what Stalin told them to do. They would do what future leaders of the Soviet Union told them to do. And that's why Eastern Europe became known as the Soviet bloc or the communist bloc. They were a bloc of countries with communist governments put in place by the Soviet Union, dominated by the Soviet Union, and they would do what the Soviet Union told them to do. They were sometimes also called satellite countries. A satellite orbits around and is controlled by the gravity of a larger object, right? The larger object here is the Soviet Union. These countries of Eastern Europe became satellites, pulled in by the gravity of the Soviet Union, under the pull of the Soviet Union. And that is exactly what Stalin's vision was. He wanted Eastern Europe to be strong and friendly to the Soviet Union, which meant they would have to have communist dictatorships that would be subordinate to the Soviet Union and do what Soviet leaders told them to do. So clearly, the goals of Churchill and Roosevelt and the goals of Stalin clashed. These were incompatible goals. Churchill and Roosevelt wanted all European nations, including the Eastern European nations, to be free, to choose their own futures, their own governments. Stalin didn't. He wanted to ensure that they remained communist dictatorships under the control of the Soviet Union. So at Yalta, how are you going to reconcile these two completely different visions for the future of Europe, particularly the future of Eastern Europe? Well, they seemed to reconcile their differences in a declaration that was called the Declaration of Liberated Europe. This Declaration of Liberated Europe was supposed to be a kind of compromise that would satisfy both Churchill and Roosevelt on the one hand and Stalin on the other hand. The Declaration of Liberated Europe stated that every nation of Europe would be free to choose their own futures and choose their own governments, and that freedom would manifest itself in the form of free elections. So the Declaration of Liberated Europe promised that within a year after the end of the war against Germany, within a year after Germany's surrender, Soviet soldiers would be withdrawn from the countries of Eastern Europe. And the Soviets and the communist dictatorships which the Soviets had established in those countries would allow free elections so that the people of those countries could now choose their own governments. If they chose to keep communism, fine. But these elections were meant to be free elections in which the people would be given a real choice between keeping communism or choosing something else. So that's what was promised in the Declaration of Liberated Europe, that after 1 year, the Soviet Union would pull its troops out of Eastern Europe, and the communist dictatorships who ran those countries that had been installed by the Soviets would allow free elections so that the people of those countries would get to choose their own governments and choose their own futures. You say, well, that sounds like Churchill and Roosevelt got everything they wanted. What did Stalin get out of it? Well, what Stalin got out of it was a year in which his armies would occupy those countries, and in which the communist dictatorships installed by the Soviet Union and subservient to the Soviet Union would have an opportunity to consolidate their power and try to win over the people of those countries, so that when those free elections were held, the communists would have a fighting chance of actually winning the elections. So the idea was that there would be 1 year that the Soviets would continue to control these countries, both in terms of their military presence and in terms of the governments there. And then it would be up to the people to decide. So it was meant to be a sort of a compromise. Now, the reality is this: Stalin had no intention of keeping any of these promises. And he said so, not obviously to the leaders of the Western countries, to Churchill, to Roosevelt, but when he went back and spoke to his advisors, some of them were really alarmed that he had made this promise. And Stalin said, we don't really have to keep this promise. Like, what matters is the fact that we have soldiers occupying these countries. And there's really nothing the Western countries can do about that. So if in a year we choose to keep our soldiers there and not hold free elections, there's really nothing that Britain and the United States can do. So the reality is that he had made this promise at Yalta, but he had never really intended to keep this promise. In retrospect, a lot of people have been very critical of Franklin D. Roosevelt. A lot of Americans were critical of Franklin D. Roosevelt. They felt like he had sold out Eastern Europe at the Yalta Conference. The thing is, it's unclear what else he could have done. He probably got the best deal that he could get. In order to force the Soviets to end their occupation of Eastern Europe immediately, rather than sort of giving them a year, that would have required the United States and Britain, after defeating Germany, to then go to war against the Soviet Union. And that would have been very difficult. The Soviet Union still had a very powerful military, well entrenched in Eastern Europe, and it would have been difficult to explain to the American people. For 4 years, we had been declaring that the Soviet Union was our ally. We had sent billions of dollars worth of war materials to the Soviet Union to help support their war effort. Franklin D. Roosevelt referred to Joseph Stalin as Uncle Joe. We had done our best to humanize Joseph Stalin, who was a totalitarian dictator every bit as bad as Hitler, but to humanize him to the American people so that they would accept our alliance with him. How could you now say that we had to go to war with the Soviet Union, who would still be using some surplus war materials that we had sent them during the war against us? How could you explain to the American people that they were our enemy, not our ally now? And how could you tell that to the American soldiers and the families of American soldiers who were going to be desperate to return home now that the war seemingly was over? How could you now tell them that it was time to fight another war? They wouldn't accept it. The American public wouldn't accept it. The American soldiers wouldn't accept it. So, although it is true that in the end, the Yalta Agreement was violated by Stalin, he didn't keep any of his promises. The Declaration of Liberated Europe was essentially torn up by Stalin. And although it meant that for the next 45 years, because that is how long Soviet troops remained in Eastern Europe, according to the Declaration of Liberated Europe, they promised to be withdrawn after 1 year. they remained there for the next 45 years. And so for the next 45 years, Eastern Europe remained under communist control. Although all that is true, it's not really clear that Franklin Roosevelt did an awful job at Yalta. It's not really clear that he could have done better. In all likelihood, given the circumstances, he probably got the best deal that he could. He was just dealing with a person, Joseph Stalin, who essentially had no morals. I mean, who was a totalitarian dictator who was willing to make promises and then break them as soon as he made them. So that was how the Yalta Agreement looked like a compromise. It seemed like a compromise between the visions of the Western democracies on one hand and Stalin's vision on the other hand. In the end, that compromise failed, and Stalin ended up taking over and controlling Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe for the next 45 years. But that was not the only conference relating to the future of Eastern Europe or the future of Europe in general. There was a second conference then held in July of 1945 after Germany was defeated. And this conference was held at Potsdam, just outside Berlin, and it produced a series of agreements called the Potsdam Agreements. So at the end of this section, I hope you'll be able to explain how Germany and its capital, Berlin, were divided up amongst the victorious Allied powers, and why this division had the potential to cause conflict. We'll take you to the Potsdam Conference, introduce you again to President Harry Truman, and talk about the Allied powers' zones of occupation in Germany. So now I'm taking you to the bottom of page 5. So again, the Yalta Conference took place in February of 1945, at which time the war was still going on. Germany was not yet defeated. Their defeat was imminent, but they were not yet defeated. That was February of 1945. Germany then surrendered in May of 1945. That brought an end to the war in Europe. There was then another conference held in July of 1945 after Germany's defeat. This conference was held at Potsdam, which is located just outside Berlin. Potsdam was home of the palace that was the home to the royal family of Prussia and then of Germany, back when Germany was still ruled by the Kaisers. Okay? So Potsdam was home to this palace, and that's where the conference took place between a new version of the Big Three. By now, Franklin D. Roosevelt had died. Franklin D. Roosevelt died in April of 1945. So Yalta Conference in February, Franklin D. Roosevelt died in April, Germany surrendered in May, the Potsdam Conference was in July. So by now, President Roosevelt had died, and he had been replaced by his vice president, Harry Truman. So the man in the middle, Harry Truman, was the president of the United States at the time of the Potsdam Conference. You'll notice that Winston Churchill was also not there. He had not died, but there had been an election in Britain. In between the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference, there had been an election, and in that election, Winston Churchill's political party had lost its majority in the British Parliament. And since his party had lost the majority, he ceased to be prime minister. The Labour Party, which was their competitive party, the opposition party, had now gained a majority, and their leader, Clement Attlee, became prime minister. Now, Winston Churchill attended the Potsdam Conference with Clement Attlee, the man on the left, to help advise him, but by that time he was no longer prime minister. Attlee was. But then, of course, Joseph Stalin's still there, right? Joseph Stalin was the only one of the three Allied leaders to make it all the way through the war. The three major Allied leaders. President Roosevelt had died. Churchill was no longer prime minister, but good old Joseph Stalin is still there. So the Potsdam Conference focused specifically on the future of Germany. The rest of Eastern Europe was held sort of blameless for the war, right? The rest of Eastern Europe, even those countries that ended up aligning with Germany, were supposed to be set free, okay? They were, again, the occupation of Eastern Europe was only to last 1 year, at least according to the promise Stalin had made, and then those countries were to be free to choose their own governments through free elections. That's not going to be the case with Germany, because Germany is the one that started this war. So they're going to be treated differently than the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe were victims of German aggression. They were the victims of the war started by Germany. So Germany will be treated differently. The question is, how will Germany be treated? And that's what the Potsdam Conference was all about. If the Yalta Conference was all about the future of the rest of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, the Potsdam Conference was about the future of Germany. And the decision was made to divide Germany up, that Germany was to be occupied, and not for just 1 year either. Now, there was no final decision at Potsdam how long Germany would be occupied, but it wasn't only going to be 1 year. I think generally speaking, the expectation was that Germany would probably be occupied for a period of maybe 5 years. So they divided Germany up into 4 zones of occupation. The British received an occupation zone, which is that green zone. The Americans received an occupation zone, which is that sort of yellow or gold or orange zone. The Soviets received an occupation zone, which is the red one. And France also received an occupation zone, which is the blue one. You say, well, wait a minute. What did the French do to win the war? I mean, we understand the role that the Americans and British and Soviets played in defeating Germany, but really, what did the French do? They got crushed by the Germans. Well, that's true. The reason why the French received a zone of occupation was this. Germany was going to be forced to pay reparations. Okay, so you remember from World War I what reparations are. Reparations are payment. You have to make a payment for the damage that you caused during the war. Now, unlike World War I, where you could dispute whether Germany was really the country that caused the war, in World War II, you really couldn't dispute that. Germany, Nazi aggression, was the cause of the war, period. And so, since Germany caused the war, they would have to pay for the damages. They would have to pay reparations, just as they had done in World War I. But if you remember, in World War I, the Allied powers had created a sort of a total value of money that the Germans were going to have to pay. And they set that value based upon what they demanded, not what Germany could afford to pay. Right? And as it turned out, Germany was not able to pay the reparations. The reparations were too high. And that caused all sorts of problems that helped to lead to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. So this time around, the Allies didn't approach it that way. They are going to collect reparations from Germany. But what they're going to do is, instead of money, a fine that Germany's going to have to pay, the agreement was that you could take reparations from the zone of occupation that you had. So whatever resources Germany had that were present in that occupation zone, you could take those resources for a certain number of years as reparations payments. So the reason why France received a zone of occupation was so that they could receive reparations, so that they could take from that zone resources, things like coal or iron ore or whatever. You could take resources from that zone as a way of taking reparations to compensate for the damages that Germany caused during the war. The only country that really didn't take reparations from their zone of occupation was the United States, because very little damage was caused to the United States as a result of the war. There was plenty of damage caused to Britain. Remember that the Germans had bombed London relentlessly during the Blitz in preparation for the invasion of Britain. The invasion didn't happen, but the bombing did. Of course, France was overrun by the Germans. And of course, the Soviet Union was devastated by the German invasion. So the British, French, and Soviets were taking reparations pretty liberally from their occupation zones. That's why France had a zone. But these 4 countries would then occupy Germany for a period of about 5 years while Germany's government was reconstituted. The goal in the long run was for Germany to eventually become a free, independent, self-governing, and whole country again. The intention was that under the supervision of the Allied powers, Germany would have a reconstituted government, a new constitution, And once that constitution and that government was up and running to the satisfaction of these countries, and that an independent Germany would not be a threat to its neighbors, then the four countries would withdraw their troops, and Germany would reemerge as an independent, self-governing, and not occupied country. How long would that take? Again, they thought probably 5 years. So that was the plan for Germany, a period in which it would be occupied, maybe 5 years, and then eventually it would be prepared for self-government and become self-governing again. One other thing you might notice is that not only was Germany divided up, but Germany's capital, Berlin, was actually also divided up between the four countries. And if you blow this up, you see it looks like this. So because Berlin was the capital and sort of the power center of Germany, that city was also divided up between the Allied powers. And each of them would have a zone of occupation in Berlin, just as they had a zone of occupation in Germany as a whole. So you see a French zone, a British zone, an American zone, and a Soviet zone. And relatively speaking, the zones were determined by where the armies were at the end of the war. The American army had come across the French countryside and had occupied sort of the southern part of Western Germany. The British had come up the coast and occupied the northern part of Western Germany. The Soviets had come in from the east. And so Berlin is divided up the same way. And while the Allied powers agreed that this was meant to be temporary, it did create the potential for some awkward situations. So you take note that the French, British, and American zones of Western Berlin are located fully inside the Soviet occupation zone of Eastern Germany. There's 100 miles here that was separating Western Berlin from the nearest occupation zone of any of the countries that occupied Western Berlin. So it was strange to have, these Western occupation zones fully inside the Soviet occupation zone of Eastern Germany. Now, Joseph Stalin promised that there would always be road and railroad and air access into Western Berlin, into the Western occupation zones of Berlin. He promised road, rail, and air access into that area. But as time progressed, Germany was going to be taken in two different directions. The Western democracies were going to take their occupation zones, of course, in the direction of becoming democracies with capitalist economies, free market economies. The Soviets were going to maintain their eastern zone as a communist dictatorship. And what that meant was that in the long run, it was going to be very difficult for Germany to become a reunited country. The western part of Germany was going to become one thing, the eastern part was going to become something completely different. It also meant that Western Berlin was going to become this sort of island of free market capitalism and democracy in the midst of a communist dictatorship. And that was going to create awkward situations and even conflict because you had this sort of free world bastion right in the middle of the communist bloc. And Berlin, in the long run, would become sort of ground zero for the Cold War conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. So there you go, a little lesson in how conferences at the end of World War I helped to set the stage for the Cold War, how agreements made by the Americans and British on one hand, the Soviet Union on the other hand, were meant to ensure that the future of Europe would be a peaceful transition from war to peace. But both of those agreements, both the Yalta and the Potsdam agreements, actually set the stage for the breakup of the alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union and the beginning of conflict between them. So that's it for this lesson. We'll look forward to teaching you the next one. Until then, Modern World History students, I hope you can stay healthy and safe. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.